It was clear that acting Captain Hill was not pleased with how the events had unfolded, but his main focus was now to prevent the Hercule from running aground. He had been called up after the guns fell silent. Of course, the screams of the many wounded were still audible, particularly those like the Irishman Lee's, who was now having what was left of his leg amputated. As you emerged topside, you caught your first glimpse of the battle damage. Multiple parts of the rigging and at least a quarter of the exposed sails were now torn and shredded, hanging limp. Thankfully, the wind and the resulting waves were in your ship's favor. This was the eastern side of the island, which for much of the West Indies made it the leeward side, meaning drier, as the West Indies benefit from fairly consistent eastern trade winds that bring the rain to the eastern sides first. So what little wind was left, and now slowly picking up, was assisting the efforts of the crew. Their sole focus, preventing the Hercule from continuing towards the rocky shore and the certain disaster that would result from not doing so. Within 30 minutes, the drilled crew had the Hercule limping back towards open waters and the rendezvous with the HMS Goliath. The officers were unusually silent. It was clear, having let the French vessel both best the Hercule and escape, was not sitting well with them. Acting Captain Hill's view as the Goliath came closer was not on the Goliath herself, but on the clearly French vessel beside her. The Goliath, under the command of Captain Thomas Foley, had done what he had failed to do: capture and beat a French vessel. It was clear he was not looking forward to the upcoming encounter. It turned out that the French vessel was a ship corvette named the Mignon. She was manned by a crew of 80 with 16 18-pounder guns and was on her way back to the French homeland. The Hercule would, under escort, limp her way back to Port Royal for repairs that would take a few months to complete before the next assignment could be carried out. An assignment that would take you from the ship-to-ship battle at sea to a conflict waged on land. For now, though, there was at least some time to relax outside of the repairs, which ran 6 days of the week, and for promotions and demotions to be doled out. Acting Captain Hill was restored to first lieutenant, and a new captain by the name of Dunn was installed on the ship. You, for your actions with the raising of the signal, in addition to overall merit, were made an able seaman, an honor which you received with much pride. It was unusual for someone with less than 2 years' experience to be made an able seaman, but clearly your merchant experience and the fact you were well acquainted with your duty played a significant role. Land had a way of making sailors quickly soft, and you longed to get back onto the open waters, and thankfully in late January of 1804, that happened, when the Hercule would make her first real tests in the waters off Port Royal. The loss of the Pursuivant still stung, but there was clear joy among the crew at being back at sea. Even First Lieutenant Hill was seen to smile on her first exit of Port Royal. Most of the crew had been hoping that the next assignment would involve routine convoy or blockade duty. Unfortunately, the HMS Hercule, along with the HMS Thesis and 2 smaller frigates, were to rendezvous with the HMS Vanguard at the Dutch-held island of Curacao. The captain of the Theseus, John Bligh, would have overall command of the 3 vessels. Sir John Ducksworth, the commander-in-chief at Jamaica Station, had received intelligence that the Dutch, who had recently reacquired Curacao from the British, had no reinforcements and but 160 men facing disease, and thus your squadron was to go and attack the fort and retake the island. With your ships totaling some 600 men in addition to those of the Vanguard, the outlook appeared most favorable. It was a 3-day sail to the island's southwestern side, where there was a large natural harbor in the form of a bay. It was in this bay that the Dutch Fort Amsterdam stood. Despite being January, this particular day was extremely hot, and made worse by the lack of strong winds outside the naturally sheltered harbor. Captain Bligh sent in one of his officers the following morning at daybreak to negotiate with the island's governor while the ships waited outside the harbor. After 5 long, tense hours, the officer returned with word that the Dutch had steadfastly refused to surrender. Word spread through the officers of the ships and then crew that Bligh was to initiate a blockage of the port. He sent the frigates Blanche and Pique to block the harbor and made the decision to enter a small cove with both the Hercule and Thesis, even though the Vanguard had still not arrived. As your ship entered the cove, the silence was shattered by the eruption of a thunderous cannon discharge from a shore battery. Both ships quickly returned fire for roughly 30 minutes, near the end of which Bligh landed a party of some 30 sailors and marines to storm the battery and secure the cove. Within minutes, they had secured their objective, and within the hour they'd begun to storm the heights of the cove around them. From your vantage point atop the sails, you could see the men climbing the elevation, but you could also make out the shapes of the Dutch forces atop the slopes. Your ship was signaling the Marines to their presence, and soon the two sides exchanged fire. You would learn that one Marine died and 4 others were injured in that exchange, but the Dutch were driven to the nearby town of St. Anne. It had been hot just outside the bay, but here, in the cover of the cove, it was positively sweltering. Both ships anchored here and unloaded several cannons in addition to the roughly 600 men, of which you were one. A landing base was quickly established, protected by the cannons brought ashore and those left on board the ship. Preparations were made to attack the town of St. Anne within 2 hours' time. The Marines who had taken the hill had been bolstered by their comrades, and a force of some 150 Royal Marines now held the heights above the cove. Word soon got down to the larger group that some scouting Marines had discovered the Dutch forces were considerably larger than the 160 the intelligence from Duckworth had suggested. Clearly, they had in fact received reinforcements. While you weren't privy to the direct conversations of the officers, there was clearly hope that at least the disease portion of the intelligence was correct. The decision was made to attack the town at 3 p.m. so the Dutch could not establish additional defenses. The Dutch town of St. Anne was laid out in the typical efficient fashion of the Dutch. Every building had a purpose and reason for being where it was placed. In contrast to the alleys and carriageways of London, which circled back on themselves sometimes multiple times and could likely keep an invading enemy at bay for weeks just trying to figure out what led where. This made the initial attack of the town, at least on paper, seem achievable. The Marines would lead the frontal charge along with most of the men, while your group would start a fire. You and a handful of the best topsmen had the unenviable task, owing to your dexterity, of starting a fire from one of the higher buildings to the lower ones below. A fire that would hopefully distract the Dutch townfolk and their military long enough to secure strategic buildings elsewhere. The decision was made to enter a small grove of trees and scale up a church building there. The town appeared abandoned, but you knew full well that the militia and soldiers were there below somewhere, simply waiting. The grove would afford the cover needed to approach the building from its eastern side. The small group volunteered you as the first to scale the building. You could feel your heartbeat thumping in your chest. This wasn't the sheer terror of the at-sea battle, nor was it one of fear of discovery. At sea, you'd been involved in the battle, but it was not your hand that pulled the string of the firing pin. Yet, here you were, the one to start a fire that would in all likelihood lead to the ending of lives. From one day to the next, your actions would certainly alter events in some way negatively. That was a fear foreign to you, and yet here it was, real and pending with every heartbeat, every breath. You inched your way to the building and picked a corner to scale out of view of any windows or doorways. You were used to the wooden grips placed at intervals on the masts, meant for humans to climb upon, but here was a building clearly not similarly designed. There were no predetermined handholds or footholds, and so you made each grip and pull-up work as you scaled the building's exterior, almost slipping twice. Soon, you were on the lower of the 2 roofs. The next would be a much quicker scale. Your men threw you up several torches. The original plan had been for one of the Royal Marines to throw a grenade of the type common to both the French and British military, but the resulting noise would have been too loud. What was needed was a stealthier, slower starting fire that would then spread quickly, and so here you found yourself now upon the highest point of the building. The end being near, you thought, yet the moment just beginning. You hesitated for what felt like hours. In reality, only a few minutes had passed. In the end, you did your duty, as you had been instructed, but the actions would haunt your future dreams at regular intervals, and throwing the first of the 5 torches to the rooftops below was the point you could no longer retreat from. And so you threw the rest, as had been planned, and quickly rejoined your comrades. Within 10 to 15 minutes, the entire quadrant of the town was burning, and the flames grew higher by the minute. However, owing to the Dutch design of the town, the fire should spread only so far, as the artificial canal sealing the quadrant off should in theory provide a barrier for the advancing flames. The Marines charged in, as did the rest of the men, and while there were skirmishes, the town was captured without much resistance. The reasons for this would soon be clear. The townspeople had essentially left the town for another on the opposite side of the bay. There were no liberator ceremonies, as the British rule of the previous 3 years was still a stinging recent memory. The British and the Dutch had a long history, and while there were stretches of peace, the two nations had also fought several bloody naval wars, and the ethnic slurs leveled at each other grew in terms of creativity by the generation. That first Saturday evening was a solemn one as a result. The men ate quietly in groups in the main square in the shadow of the administrative buildings now flying the British flag. That evening, the counterattacks began. The Dutch would be relentless in the weeks to come. There was not a day in February without conflict. Attempts to leave the town in new directions were fought to bloody stalemates. The Dutch controlled the surrounding towns and the environments just outside this one. Oddly, the path to the ships they tended to not attack, almost as if offering the British a way out, should you choose to select it. The Dutch had an estimated 500 or so men, and contrary to hope and desire, disease was not present in their ranks. The same could not be said for your lot. By the first week of February, dysentery had a firm grip on many of the men. While the name sounded sterile and clinical, its effects were decidedly not. Along with it came fever, strong abdominal pains and cramps that continued unabated, that sleep did not resolve, each bodily movement bloody and never reaching a satisfactory conclusion. The men associated this with the accursed presence of the Dutch, the cheeseheads. The weeks dragged on, and the incidence of dysentery only grew worse. With the men growing weaker and the Dutch attacks getting bolder and bolder, low morale was becoming a clear problem. Rumor was that Captain Bligh had orders to not overextend his presence, but soon February would turn into March, and conditions were now downright squalid. And the feeling among the men was that the Dutch would regain the town any day. On the 4th of March, with ammunition for the 18-pounders brought ashore, finally exhausted, Captain Bligh made the decision to leave the town. On that last day, the tally of dead British had reached 18, with 43 wounded in the skirmishes of the previous 5 weeks. The ships were loaded within hours. There was still no sign of the vanguard. This time, the limp back to Port Royal was aboard almost pristine ships, with crews barely able to fulfill their onboard functions. It would be a long 3-day sail back to Port Royal, Jamaica Station. I want to thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, please hit that like button. If you enjoy the content on this channel but haven't yet, please consider subscribing. And until the next video, and as always, cheers.